And so with home prices, I mean, do you believe that this idea that as a result of this lawsuit, home prices will come down?
Well, it's interesting because the data doesn't support that.
This lawsuit wasn't just against that a particular broker, it was really against the entire industry.
The entire industry.
What changes are we going to see? Like, what can real estate agents, and then I want to talk about the consumers, but for real estate agents, what changes can we expect to come on August 17th?
Yeah, so the requirements, I think there's a lot of noise. And the reality is that there's really 5 substantive changes that are required in the lawsuit.
And so this lawsuit doesn't actually state that there's going to be no more buyer agents.
No, it actually doesn't say that at all.
My name is Daniel Walcott, Realtor with MG Residential and Keller Williams Capital Properties, and welcome back to my channel where we discuss all things real estate investing, and home ownership. Today I have the joy and pleasure of having a one-on-one conversation with Kymber Menkiti. She's the co-owner and president of Keller Williams Capital Properties, which is a brokerage that oversees 10 offices in Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. She is the Keller Williams Regional Director for the entire Maryland, D.C. region, which encompasses over 4,500 agents. She's the former president of the D.C. Association of Realtors and currently a board member for the Bright MLS, which is the Mid-Atlantic multiple listing service that spans 40,000 square miles, Delaware, Maryland, Washington, D.C., parts of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and even West Virginia. So one of the largest MLSs in the country. And then for over 15 years, she's also led the MG Residential sales team, which is the residential arm of the Menkiti Group. So it's safe to say you know a thing or two about real estate.
There's a few things. You did that so well. I'm like, thank you, Daniel. I'm going to bring you around all the time. Like, yes, that's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. And so today what I wanted to discuss is really what's on everybody's mind, which is the NAR lawsuit and the changes that are set to be made on August 17th.
They're right around the corner.
Yeah. And so how did we get here to this point?
Yeah, it's sort of one of those gradually then suddenly. People are like, oh my goodness, August 17th. And the reality is it's been about 5 years in the making, right?
Okay.
So there were multiple lawsuits, but there was a primary lawsuit that was actually centered in Missouri, which was a lawsuit that was from a cohort of sellers that came together to form a class for a class action lawsuit that really said, hey, we believe that the way that seller commissions, which then obviously impacted buyers, had us overpaying for both commission services that then created an impact to our overall home values.
Okay. And so this lawsuit wasn't just against that a particular broker, it was really against the entire industry.
The entire industry. That's right. So they not only named the National Association of Realtors, which represents about 1.5 million realtors around the country, they also named all of the major brokerages in the U.S.
Okay. And so the lawsuit, they settled, and so to a tune of $418 million.
That's right. So the National Association of Realtors, which represents all of the realtors, right, settled for the $418 million. Each of the individual brokerages also did. So overall, right, the settlement was north of $500 million. And so in addition to the financial part of the settlement, which then covers the entire class of sellers, not just in Missouri, right, across the U.S.,
right,
there were also some terms that had to be complied with, right, that as an industry impact all realtors and then ultimately buyers and sellers and consumers.
So let's talk about that. These are nationwide changes that essentially all agents have to adhere to because, like you said, it's a class action lawsuit. And so the point of these changes, really the goal, as I understand it, as I was researching for this conversation, was they wanted to achieve 2 things. They had the belief that through this class action lawsuit, we can see a decrease in home prices and to make home ownership more affordable, which we'll talk about. And then the second thing was to remove cooperation between the listing agent who represents the seller and the buyer's agent who represents the buyer. Is that correct?
So think about cooperation and compensation.
Okay.
Sort of 2 things that they were really trying to say, hey, we believe that these 2 things are detrimental to the consumer, right, in the industry. And so we want to disrupt, right, completely transition the way the industry is evolving.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with home prices, I mean, do you believe that this idea that as a result of this lawsuit, home prices will come down?
Well, it's interesting because the data doesn't support that, right? If we just look even over the last 20 years, the average home price in the United States has more than tripled. while the commission rate during that same period of time has decreased. So in 20 years, we've seen a tripling of the equity of the overall home price that a home seller is recognizing.
Right.
So it actually hasn't proved to be a correlation that is supported in the data.
Okay. And as I was reading this, it really didn't make any sense to me, because if as a seller, I want higher prices, because when I sell my property, I get to make more money.
Right. It's the number one way that people build wealth in the United States, right? Home ownership.
And so the second part, however, is this idea of cooperation and compensation. Who pays who? And I think that's where we're going to see the biggest change on and after August 17th.
That's right. I think there was also a misconception that was always around, right? Buyer agency was, you think about this pendulum about 30 years ago. It's not something that has been around forever. So prior to that, buyer agents did not have representation. And so one of the challenges there was that, like, similar to the movement today, there was a movement then saying, hey, this really isn't. The buyer does deserve their own representation and a fiduciary that's representing and protecting their interests. Like, remember, this is the number one way people are building wealth. It's the largest financial purchase many of us ever make is the purchase of that home. So having somebody to represent our interests, to help mitigate our risk in that process, and to guide us came about through a lot of advocacy from buyers and from agents who believed that was necessary. So there's sort of this interesting, people forget that it's not actually that old, right, in terms of having buyer agencies in the transaction at all.
And so this lawsuit doesn't actually state that there's going to be no more buyer agents.
No, it actually doesn't say that at all, right? It's saying, hey, we just need the buyer agent to have their agreement with their client specify exactly how they would be paid. Because the reality was a lot of buyers did not understand how their agent was being paid because the compensation was being shared between the listing agent and the buyer agent.
Right.
And so there was a lot of confusion in the marketplace. So I think in part the settlement does allow, I think it increases transparency so that a buyer understands what's fully happening, and that the agent, and it's different by jurisdiction, right? In our jurisdiction, the DMV, buyer agent agreements have always been required. So while that's a nationwide settlement term, that's one that in our market, right, has already been, because the jurisdictions were maybe ahead of their time and already required buyer agency agreements.
So agents and possibly consumers to that specific point aren't going to see a real change, right? Because the idea of buyer agency has existed. The buyer agency agreement, like you said, it's commonplace for us to use it. And so what changes are we going to see? Like, what can real estate agents, and then I want to talk about the consumers, but for real estate agents, what changes can we expect to come on August 17th?
Yeah, so the requirements, I think there's a lot of noise. And the reality is that there's really 5 substantive changes that are required in the lawsuit. And the first one, I think, will be a change on both sides, because the settlement agreement says that a buyer agency agreement, so that agreement between the buyer agent and a buyer, will be in place and define compensation before the first showing. So the practice has definitely been in some parts, right, even in our market, where you might see a house before the agency agreement gets signed. And you might meet at the property first before you have that sit-down consultative process with somebody. This will require that before that happens, even in a virtual showing, that agreement is already in place and compensation is defined. So that's going to be a change that I think the consumer, the buyer, is going to feel, and the agent's going to need to comply with to make sure that it's clear and that there's compensation.
Yeah, I think that's huge, because honestly, like in our market, there are certain situations in which, hey, I want to see a house really quick, and sometimes like it really just could be like a fun experience. Like, hey, I just want to check out this property,
check it out.
But this lawsuit, as you're saying, like it's stating that no, before we go out to view a property, we have to have a buyer agency agreement signed.
That's right, and it has to define compensation.
Okay,
that's right. Yeah.
And so, what is another change that we're seeing?
Yeah. You think there's really just 4 other big ones.
Okay.
And one is that no compensation can be represented as free, right?
Okay.
So you can't say like, hey, in writing, this service is free, right? When in fact there's compensation that's going to be paid or expected.
Okay.
So it can't be free as advertised. The seller has to have in writing how they're going to provide compensation if they are. So if it doesn't preclude a seller from continuing to offer compensation to a buyer agent or a concession to a buyer to offset their cost that could include a commission, right? That's not actually precluded, but it does have to be in writing. So it has to be in writing what the compensation is.
Okay.
And then you can't filter out, which is everyone's like, I don't filter out anyway, right? You can't filter as an agent. Your agent can't filter out properties based on what the compensation offer is from the seller. And then the last one, it has to be very clearly stated that all compensation is negotiable, which it's always been, but it needs to be stated in the agreements that compensation is negotiable.
And I know agents watching this, as you sort of mentioned, like there are certain things that were already in practice. And so I think in an agent's mind, they may think, well, hey, I've already been running my business this way, so there's not actually any real change to me. And I'll be honest, that's what I thought as well until we had a meeting last week, kind of going over the paperwork. And so I just want to touch on that a little bit because for agents in DC and the changes in Maryland are different and the changes in Virginia are different.
In terms of the forms, right?
In terms of the forms,
the settlement itself, nationwide.
Yes.
But each jurisdiction has taken a different view on how the forms in a buyer agency agreement or a listing agreement or the actual purchase contract between the buyer and the seller, it looks a little different.
Yeah.
So for a lot of us who practice in multiple jurisdictions, we're having to look at each of those jurisdictions' legal documents differently. Yeah.
Which we're used to when it comes to the sales contract, but now we have to be a little more attentive because, again, as buyer agents, this is how we get paid. And so for DC specifically, one change that I was looking at in the paperwork was the fact that, and you might have mentioned it, the fact that whatever is stated in the buyer agency agreement, I cannot get paid anything above that, whether it comes from the seller, the buyer, or whoever, right?
That's right.
And I think that's a huge change because there used to be different incentives that sellers used to put into their descriptions to incentivize people to purchase and show the property.
That's right. Well, if you look at our market today, right, despite the fact that there's a lot of demand, we're seeing listing inventory increase, right? So you've got 20% more houses on the market today than the same period last year, which means, to your point, like a seller might want to incentivize, hey, I've got a property, I've got a condo in DC, it's been on the market for 30 days, I want to get more people to come and see it. So I put out an incentive saying, hey, buyer agents, bring your clients, check me out, send it to them, and I'll pay you an extra incentive. If that is above what you've already agreed to as your fee for the service you're providing in your buyer agency agreement, you would not be able to collect that additional compensation.
Right. And another change that we're seeing specifically within our, nationwide MLS is that the compensation is removed from the MLS. So we're not going to be able to see that. It cannot be listed in disclosures. And also, as I was looking through the lawsuit, they can't even create another website to say, go here to find out what compensation is. It has to be removed completely. Is that right?
Well, so that's a good question. So one of the terms was that all references to compensation had to be removed from all MLSs that were affiliated with with NAR, the National Association of Realtors, and anything that feeds into. So what the MLS does is acts as sort of that number one entry source where all agents are putting their listing information, and then the listing gets distributed out to pretty much every other major portal that you would go to, and minor, right? These smaller portals that then provide the listing information. That all comes from one point of entry.
Right.
So none of those, anything going into the MLS can have no reference to compensation. That doesn't mean that today, if a seller said, hey, I still want to offer compensation, they're absolutely allowed to do that.
Okay.
It cannot be advertised through the MLS. It could be on a private website. It could be on a social media post that the agent does. I walked into an open house this past weekend and it was on a piece of paper sitting at the table with the flyer. So they can still communicate it. It can't be communicated through anything that filters out through the MLS. You could do a property specific website to advertise 123 Main Street and that could include it in it. But it cannot filter, it can't be the information being pulled from the MLS.
From a listing agent's point of view, for DC specifically right now, it essentially outlines different scenarios, right? As I understood, it was a scenario in which, this is what I'm paying you, right? You're my agent, you're my broker. This is what I'm paying you to list and market my property, to list, market, and sell my property. then there's different caveats. If a buyer comes in unrepresented, the compensation can change.
100%. Yeah.
If a buyer comes in represented, I now have, and I want to be clear, sellers always had this option,
Always.
whether they wanted to pay or not pay a buyer's agent. But that is outlined there, that it's not set by law, that
That's
it's
right.
optional, it's
That's right.
completely up to them.
It is. And I think what's interesting is these are offers of compensation,
Mhm.
just like a sales price.
Right.
When you advertise your property, you put a sales price in the
Mhm.
system. Like, the reality is very few of houses actually sell for the exact, it's like a due date, right? Like,
Yeah.
it is there, but
Mhm.
it's negotiable. A
Yeah.
buyer's going to look at the comps, they're going to look at the detail, they're going
Mhm.
to look at their motivation to purchase the property,
Yeah.
and they're going to make an offer. So the same thing when you think about the compensation. It was always, right, a negotiated term in
Right.
the contract. And so I think that that's still the case. And it is being clear about, is the buyer represented, are they unrepresented? And then I think what we're going to see is that as contracts and offers are submitted for listings,
Mhm.
the buyer's going to have, they can write in as a term what they're looking for from the seller as it
Mhm.
relates to both concessions and compensation.
Right, and that's what I'm glad you brought that up, because I want to touch on that next. From a buyer's perspective, what is, can you briefly explain the difference between this idea of concession and compensation? Because it is different, right? We know that in negotiations, in certain situations, buyers can request up to 3%, or if they're using an FHA loan, up to 6%, for the seller to pay their closing costs. But that doesn't include the buyer agent's compensation, is that right?
It does now, right?
Okay.
And it really, arguably, it could have under different loan products. So different loan products are going to have different requirements,
Mhm.
right? That in terms of how much a buyer can receive back from a seller in that concession,
Okay.
which is the seller credit, right?
Mhm.
So we haven't seen that in our market in the last couple of years as frequently because home prices and the inventory was so limited.
Mhm.
And so buyers are really looking to be competitive in their offers, which you're less competitive perhaps if you're depending on that as a term of what you're putting in. So a buyer can ask for, hey, this is the price that I'm offering to purchase the property,
Mhm.
and seller, I want this concession back, right? I want you to credit me back
Mhm.
a certain percentage, a certain dollar amount that then I have based on lender terms.
Mhm.
There's certain fees, closing cost fees,
Right.
that then that can cover. That could cover point buy downs, that could cover some of the fees that I have as a buyer that are related to transactional fees.
Mhm.
That can also cover the agreed upon commission compensation that I'm then going to be that I've under agreement to pay out to my real estate agent. So that's that has always been the case.
Right.
I think it's going to become even more required, especially for our first-time home buyers who maybe the cash that they need to close is
Mhm.
more limited, right? They're
Right.
putting all their cash towards the down payment. And so that means the fees, which can range anywhere from 2 to 5, 6%, depending on your loan product, depending on the
Mhm.
fees that you have in a jurisdiction, your condos.
Right.
So that allows them some additional dollars that they have at the closing table that they can put against those fees. But there's a lot of lender requirements.
Right.
So this is where, again, like you think about the value of your real estate professional to work with your lender, to work with the title company,
Mhm.
to make sure that you're getting the transaction and the deal that you need for your purchase.
And so I know what some people out there may be thinking. Okay, so what if I'm in a scenario in which, hey, home prices are up, I don't have the money, I'm going to need this 3% for my closing costs, and now what if I come across a property in which the seller hasn't agreed to cover my agent's professional fee, compensation.
Mhm.
And so in that scenario, what you're saying that, well, that's still negotiable. That's
All
now
negotiable.
a negotiating term that we can put on the table to
100%.
say whether, I don't know, whatever the listing side, and I think that's a general idea, right? We don't know what you guys have going on. You don't know what we have
That's
going
exactly
on.
right. When the contract comes in, we know there's lots of other terms that are important
Correct.
to buyers and sellers.
Yes.
Settlement date, whether there's a post-settlement occupancy
Mhm.
period, whether or not, right, like they leave certain items in the home.
Yes.
So you think about all these terms that we advise a client on when they're preparing to submit an offer to a seller. And then the listing agent's going to help advise the seller on what those terms really mean and what the cost of them are. And so it just becomes one of those terms more visibly, more transparently. Perhaps it always was, right?
Right.
In terms of a lot of buyer agency agreements already outlined fees well before
Yes.
August 17th. And so it's really just an opportunity to make sure that all of it's transparent, it's clearly communicated, it's documented in writing, like who would have thought. And so for a lot of us who do this and have been doing this for a long time, very professionally, like this isn't a big change in terms of transparency and how we communicate to our clients, because you've already been doing that at a really high level. It is going to be a change for some people in the industry, and I think we're going to see people opt maybe out. It's going to continue to elevate, which many of us have been saying for a really long time, that we really want to see overall the professionalism and what's required and how people are treated in the industry to elevate, and this is no question this is going to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially now, since buyers are on the hook for compensating their agents, it's almost like what they expect is going to increase. And so I think naturally, as you pointed out, there's, I think for a lot of people, right, and this is what they're saying, are going to leave the industry because they may not be able to provide that type of value for the buyers. And so the cream of the crop will rise, and everybody else will either get with the program or fall to the wayside.
That's right. And I think you're going to see that. And I think buyers should expect that, right? They should be expecting that somebody's going to negotiate well on their behalf, right? Somebody's really going to be protecting fiercely their interest, that they're going to connect them to the resources that they need and really be that advisor in the transaction. So when you think about some of these numbers and people are like, I don't know that that's worth it. Well, this is your largest home purchase. And so if somebody saves you $50,000, $100,000 on overpaying for a property, is that not worth it? But we're not all created equal. And I just, you get what you pay for and you get what you want to put into it. So there's a lot of things I can learn to do on YouTube. I mean, I might not sit in the chair that I built after, right? But I can learn to figure it out. Or I can have somebody that's going to help me do that is a professional and can do that at a high level. So I think we just have to, people have to make decisions about what's best for them and what they prioritize in terms of value and their interest.
Absolutely. In closing, I do want to touch on a couple myths that may be out there, because as I was looking at different videos and reading different articles, it almost seemed like there's different agendas, right? I think even with this lawsuit, there was agenda behind the lawsuit. And so one of the myths is that the buyer agent is going away. Is that true?
Absolutely not. And I think buyers should expect and really demand that they still have representation. It's critically important that your interest is protected and represented in this transaction. Is a large financial transaction. You want somebody who is 100% aligned with your interest and who is prepared to negotiate on your behalf and make sure that they're advising and mitigating risk for you throughout the transaction. So it's definitely not going away. If anything, it just got more necessary, and the elevation of the value you got even higher.
The second myth is that home prices will drop.
We love to see that. I think everybody's like, hey, affordability, and it's interesting because buyers would love it to drop. I guarantee you, if you're a seller and you're getting ready to sell a house, like, you want the most money. That's how you're driving wealth. That's how you're passing on a legacy for your family. And so I think there's no correlation historically that it's impacted home prices. And I think we're going to see that the same here.
Okay. And then I think the third myth is that they admitted to any wrongdoing, that there was collusion. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is that you're seeing it today as we prepare to implement this, the idea that, like, behind the closed doors as an industry, everyone was colluding together. Like, every jurisdiction's releasing changes at different times as we prepare for the 17th. The forms look different. Even just in DC, Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, all the forms look different. Like, each of us is taking our own view on how we define and deliver value. And that's always been the case. So I think, if anything, this process is just proving out that there was not this big collusion in the industry to all lock in one price. The reality is that there always were discount options, rebate options. You could get your house sold for free if that's what you wanted. You could not have a buyer. Like, there always were lots of options to the consumer, and I think this is just going to continue to highlight that.
And so, in closing, what is your message to agents out there who may be worried, or buyers or sellers who are confused by this whole process? What is one thing that they should know coming on August 17th when all the changes go into effect?
I think this is really in the spirit of transparency, and I think part of why NAR chose to settle was that in the spirit, like, everybody actually wants this to be as transparent a process as possible. So being able to, it should make things clearer, not muddier. So being able to have things in writing, make sure you're really understanding the value you're delivering if you're an agent, you're receiving if you're a consumer, and making sure that that's clear and upfront. Like we all want that, right? You want to know how much something is before you have to sit down and pay for it, and what you're going to get for what you're paying for.
Right.
So I think this is a really great opportunity to elevate the professionalism and to create even more transparency in the process, which ultimately protects everybody.
Yeah.
And so I think it's going to be it's change. Change is inevitable.
Yeah.
Participation is optional, right?
Right.
Gary reminds us of that, and in this case, if you're a realtor, participation is not optional. But you could opt not to participate in the industry anymore. And I think that, unfortunately, some people will choose to get out, and I think some people will choose to get in because they're really excited about what this means.
Absolutely.
And real estate agents aren't going away, and I think it's going to continue to be a big opportunity for those that choose to dive in.
And change is uncomfortable, and with uncomfortableness comes growth.
That's right.
Awesome. So
Growth is powerful.
I appreciate your time today.
Yes, thanks, Daniel.
This was great.
Yeah,
All
awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.